What is that? That was fascinating when we started speaking about body position, and we mustn't obviously forget to come back to the maybe the aerobic and anaerobic. But you mentioned it,
Hmm.
body position. Even these sort of things, you're starting to help people understand that could lead to more fatigue or lead to arm pump in some
Hmm.
athletes.
Yeah, this expanded into quite the topic, and I'm still slowly trying to figure it out. But for all, like for instance, if I was able to attach a couple of sensors to an individual, and I could tell that they were prematurely fatiguing on a downhill run, there are essentially two things that you can then do. You can say, well, the person isn't conditioned enough. Okay, so that's the first place you'd probably start. Maybe you'd go, well, the person isn't fit enough, it's not conditioned enough, and that's what you need to work on. There's also this huge, which is outside sort of my realm of knowledge. So I've been speaking to Geordie from Fox about this, and there is this huge element about bike setup, body position. Can we get you as an individual into an optimal, position? And for instance, can we influence suspension characteristics? So if we know you are carrying slightly more fatigue coming into the last race of the weekend, can we then optimize the bike to then sort of alleviate some of that fatigue? And that's where sort of these muscle oxygen saturation data and muscle oxygen saturation sensors do come in, particularly useful. Now what we can do is we can analyze, from a downhill run, essentially what you'll see, you would strap a sensor, say, to the quad on the leg, you'd put one potentially on the upper arm, and then what you can see is during a downhill run, you'll kind of see these, it's like an SMO2 line, but you'll see this sort of come down. And what we're really looking to do is how far does that come down? If it comes down to detrimental values, which I'll be honest with you, it does at the moment. There isn't one person I've tested, including elite level athletes, that this doesn't happen. So it comes down to what we call, a drastic level. And all that essentially means is your working muscle no longer has oxygen available, and that's when we see a huge rise in sort of lactate. And that's when we end up with this sort of pain in our legs, if you want to call it that. And then what will happen is your hips have to ultimately come up to try and stretch the legs out, right, to try and alleviate some of that tension because we're in this isometric hold. Well, the problem with that is your hips rise, your body weight shifts forward, and now all of a sudden you've got this sort of weight resting on your arms. And that's where we hear a lot about forearm pump or upper body fatigue, because actually your body is now tilted slightly, your weight slightly shifted, and you're putting more pressure on the front. So you can turn around and say it's a conditioning problem, but ultimately as well, the bike, the suspension, and how it's set up will influence the body position on whether or not we can also alleviate fatigue, but also push it back to a further point in time, which is what we're trying to do through both conditioning the athlete and looking at the bike setup.
That's so interesting because you would think that the arms were the issue there, right? And you're saying, well, potentially, if you look at it, the legs have fatigued first. And if they
Always.
hadn't fatigued, then maybe your arms wouldn't feel the way they feel. Like that's the symptom comes out in the arms. But the
Mm-hmm.
cause, like in injury, anything, there's like effect and a cause, right? Was actually the legs from conditioning to bike setup. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, and it's not just, and I guess like some people will be sitting here listening right now thinking, well, great, I'll just go and do more squats and I'll build the world's most bulletproof legs anyone's ever seen, and that way my legs won't fatigue. I wish that was the case, but it's not, because, like I say, one of the problems that you have is that the working muscle, i.e. the legs, because you are in this isometric hold, and a lot of your weight is centered through your legs as you push down, and just in the isometric hold that we tend to ride in. So, yes, will increase in strength help that? Actually, no, it won't. But increase in muscular endurance will. So, like, instead of focusing on trying to increase a 3-rep max, you might want to do sub-maximal loaded work, so call it 65% of your 3-rep max. How many reps can you do in terms of a back squat? That's something else that you could look to sort of train, I guess. But one of the other elements here and I think this is the root cause of it, is it might be your oxygen uptake and delivery. So, for instance, you might not have the highest oxygen consumption and uptake. So your VO2 max might be too low for the type of work that you want to do, because obviously the more oxygen you can, essentially breathe in, the more that is delivered to the working muscle groups. But there is also a bottleneck. Like I say, you can also have a super high VO2 max and have terrible muscular conditioning. Both have to work in order for this delivery of oxygen to get to the working muscle group to stop that premature fatigue. It can't just be one or the other. You can't be in the gym all the time doing loads of reps and think, right, cool, I've been listening to Jamie. He said I need to do loads of reps, get my quads, get my hamstrings, get my glutes all fired up, well conditioned, and then have a suboptimal VO2 max. You've actually got no oxygen to deliver. And when you think about how many muscles are actually involved in stabilizing the bike and actually are in play during a downhill run, well, that oxygen's trying to get to all these different muscle groups. It's not just trying to get to the one. So while we can turn around and say, I personally believe, the root cause of arm pump is definitely a general lack of conditioning, and your legs maybe ain't conditioned enough. And who's to say what's enough? Like we hinted at the start of this podcast, there are no studies to suggest that anyone out there, even, people like Piron, even people like Bruni, there's nothing to really say that they are conditioned enough. They're winning, that's good, but we've got no benchmark to decide on, well, what is conditioned enough? We have no idea. And what is the right amount of oxygen consumption, or what is the sort of gold standard sort of oxygen uptake on downhill athletes? We don't know. So, while I'm sitting here saying all this, the reality is we don't know. But I can tell you from what I've seen using muscle oxygen saturation data, from what I've seen using portable metabolic carts, from what I've seen using lactate samples, GPS data, I can tell you that if a person doesn't have a high enough VO2 max, they're not going to be able to deliver the right amount of oxygen to the legs, and their legs will prematurely fatigue. Vice versa, I can also tell you if that person has little to no muscular endurance, localized muscular endurance in the legs, they are going to prematurely fatigue regardless of their oxygen consumption.